Hey, I'm Coury.
And I'm Triforce.
I'm sure you've heard, but we have some new consoles hitting pretty soon. Sure, the Wii U has been out for a year now, but with the Xbox One and PS4 out soon, this generation of home consoles is officially winding down.
We got to thinking about what our favorite console games from this past generation were. Everything from the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii.
We didn't have any strict criteria. These picks relied on one thing, that we enjoyed playing them. So let's get started. Here's our personal top 10 games of this generation. I was a huge fan of Remedy's Max Payne games, but I hadn't really followed the apparently tumultuous development of Alan Wake. I grabbed it on sale, and when I finally had the chance to focus on it, I fell in love almost immediately when Roy Orbison's In Dreams played. Alan Wake had my favorite licensed soundtrack of any game this gen. Overall, it's pretty simplistic in nature, but it's the story, the mystery that drove me.
I got the impression that Alan Wake's reception was mixed, but I ended up kind of loving it. I really enjoyed the story and atmosphere, and I thought the gameplay was smartly simplistic, having solid ideas at its core that didn't get bogged down in complex controls.
For me, the supernatural had always been nothing but a metaphor for the human psyche, a tool to use in writing fiction. Now, it was happening for real.
As a fan of series like Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, it didn't take much to get me hyped for Valkyria Chronicles. Its twist on turn-based strategy, with a system to let you move the same unit multiple times per phase, and of course the real-time movement of each character, made for a game design that stood out in the genre. Add in a unique pencil sketch art style, and you've got a game that is endured from early in the console generation.
Valkyria was so close to being on this list for me. I'm not a huge strategy fan, but the twist in the gameplay worked for me big time. And besides, coming from the same team that made several of my Sega favorites, there wasn't a chance I wouldn't give this a shot. I really ended up loving it. It's not enough to make this list.
Kirby Superstar on the Super Nintendo remains one of my favorite co-op games to this day. No other Kirby game came even close in fun or depth of gameplay. A decade and a half later, my dreams finally came true. Return to Dreamland is a 4-player co-op Kirby game with the same control style as Superstar, complete with tons of fun powers both old and new. I'm pretty sure it's my new favorite Kirby game.
Kirby was in a couple of really awesome games this generation. Getting back to a more typical Kirby experience was definitely a highlight and was something that was long overdue. Wasn't the last true Kirby game on the N64? Survival horror had been slim pickings since Resident Evil 4, so word of mouth convinced me to try out Dead Space, and I'm really glad I did. The nods to one of my favorite sci-fi horror films, Event Horizon, really got me on board. The design of Dead Space is really cool. The chunky, heavy-looking suits gives the universe a lived-in, functional feeling. Interestingly, the real star of the show here was the amazing sound design. Playing this on a 5.1 surround sound system is the #1 thing that landed this game on this list.
Yeah, Dead Space is one of the very few games that come to mind when I think of effective use of surround sound. Actually, it's a very compelling and polished game in pretty much every regard.
On-rail shooters are pretty much my favorite genre. Unfortunately, we don't get many games set in it, but even if we got one game as good as Sin and Punishment 2 each generation, I'd be okay with it. Seriously awesome from beginning to end. The controls are a little hard to get set in just the exact way that you want, but once you find something that works, you're in for a hell of a roller coaster ride. It's really sad this didn't go on to do better, but those who played it, they know how good it is.
Open worlds can be a bit hit or miss with me. Elder Scrolls is my kind of open world. The thing that appeals to me most is that almost every creature in the world is governed by the same stats and abilities as you are. I like the idea that the population of the game world is just as alive as the player. giving me the feeling that anything could happen in this world. Oblivion was my first real introduction to Western RPGs, and I love Fallout 3 and New Vegas, but Skyrim is simply the best out of all of those.
I think this is the generation where I finally fell in love with open world games. There's a few I really got into, Crackdown, Red Dead Redemption, and Infamous, but I haven't played Skyrim yet. It's absolutely on my someday list, but I think overall it seems intimidating, because it's not something you just dip your toe into.
I think we can put our differences behind us. For science.
I'm a sucker for a good puzzle game that puts you in direct control of an actual character. Stuff like Donkey Kong 94, Adventures of Lolo, Mighty Flip Champs. Portal is like a first-person variation on that concept, and then Portal 2 went well beyond my expectations. The characters and story are so entertaining and well performed, resulting in what's arguably the most genuinely funny game ever made. Not to mention the game itself is a pretty perfect puzzle adventure, complete with a separate 5-hour-long co-op campaign.
A huge jump over the first in every way, I thought. Co-op spun things in the best direction possible.
Oh God, you look good. Looking good, actually.
Ratchet & Clank was a series that took me a while to come around on. I lumped it in with the dearth of other mascot platformers on the PS2, but based on recommendations, I gave Tools of Destruction a shot. Fell in love and followed up with Crack in Time, which is probably the best game in the series.
This generation was my introduction to Ratchet & Clank as well. It's got slick controls, crazy weapons, and I feel like its focus on bullet dodging actually makes Ratchet & Clank really close to how I would like a 3D Contra game to play.
Bionic Commando is one of my favorite NES games, and a long-dead franchise. It was just crazy to see I was getting a remake. What Grin did with this was obviously a labor of love, and it shows. They took the base gameplay, pulled it out, and made appropriate and smart additions. Truth be told, Rearmed was probably the best remake we got all generation, and we did get a lot.
Now this is a remake. It's faithful while improving on areas where the original game could have used some variety, like boss battles. And the soundtrack is just too good. This generation gave me the opportunity to play the original Sin and Punishment on the Virtual Console, and it quickly became an all-time favorite. Star Successor lives up to the challenge and treasure-style nonsense of the original, with an important upgrade that makes the sequel the better game. Wii Remote aiming makes for a gloriously smooth rail shooter experience, a feel that just can't be replicated with analog sticks. What appeals to me about Demon's Souls and Dark Souls is the very deliberate feel of the combat, both in terms of controls as well as the way you can count on enemies to be in the same place every time you retry an area. To me, this felt like learning to play levels in an older action game like Castlevania, where you learn from your mistakes and really get to know the game as you retry each level. I feel like this is fairly unique among action RPGs, but the seamless, interconnected world design easily makes Dark Souls my preferred Souls game. I'm a big fan of that sort of thing, whether it's Metroid, Castlevania, the old Resident Evil games, and Dark Souls has perhaps the most memorable and interesting world of any of them.
I didn't play this one either. It might actually be the most loved game of the gen that I didn't play. The Last of Us could be higher on this list. Maybe it should be. I don't know. But I felt the number 5 was an appropriate place for this because it hasn't had a chance to endure like the other games on the list. I was totally hooked on this the entire way through, great stealth gameplay, and the shooting felt important. You weren't just wasting enemies on a conveyor belt. I also loved how grand the journey was. Taking you across the United States over the course of a year, it felt bigger than I was expecting.
I really wanted The Last of Us to make my list, but I ended up cutting it in favor of games that have been around long enough to make a lasting impression. But make no mistake, this is a top game of the generation, not only for solid gameplay, but also for its cast of characters.
And lastly, you do what I say, when I say it. We clear?
Sure.
Repeat it.
What you say goes.
Good.
Final Fantasy 13 would probably make a lot of people's worst lists. There's a lot it does wrong, but something in there just clicked with me. I do understand you're essentially holding up and jamming on a single button the entire time, but a great soundtrack and a fun battle system kept me in this until completion, 97 hours later. As a longtime Final Fantasy fan, I love Final Fantasy 13.
Hey, I liked Final Fantasy 13 a whole lot too. I think there's a place for linear RPGs, and I actually enjoyed seeing what an RPG is like without towns or NPC conversations. I feel like it's both a successful and flawed experiment at seeing how an RPG can be cut down and streamlined. The first times I played Mass Effect 1 and 2 was on PC. I liked them quite a bit, but being a console born and bred heathen who doesn't particularly care for mouse and keyboard controls, I later replayed Mass Effect 2 on PS3, and the experience of playing it with a good old controller quickly propelled it to one of my favorites of the generation. While the ending of the third game left me feeling a little weird, I didn't hate it, and I felt comfortable with my choice. I'm sad that no one seems to want to talk about the game that led up to that ending, because to me, it was pretty spectacular.
I think it might be slightly unfair to pick the whole trilogy as one game. It was packaged as one once they were all released, so I suppose I can let it slide. Regardless, I love these a lot too. The first was great, but it didn't really hit its stride until the second game.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I absolutely love Resident Evil 5.
No!
RE5 plays a lot like RE4, and I couldn't have asked for anything much more fun than that. But it also gave me my most satisfying co-op experiences of the generation, and a game that I'm always ready to go back to for more. It may not play up the horror aspect in the same way as older games in the series, but it fits so well into the Resident Evil universe, tying up almost every loose end in the story and giving the series' real villain some long-awaited time in the spotlight. Yeah, I'm also a pretty big fan of the B-horror story and legacy of Resident Evil. What can I say?
This is your dark horse pick right here. Much better to me than its street cred would let on.
Your plans are finished, Wesker.
There's no way out this time.
Don't you two ever tire of failing in your mission? You've really become quite an inconvenience for me.
There was a period from 2003 till 2007 where I barely followed the video game industry. Then, I tried Super Mario Galaxy. It was the game that brought me back to games full speed. The craziest part here is that you can literally pick any level in the game, and it'd be awesome. Brilliantly done in all aspects, and became my favorite Mario game. Yeah, of all of them. Bayonetta is probably the craziest game I played in the last 7 years, and I loved every second of it. Bayonetta is the best pure action game I played all gen. I don't know, maybe ever. Logging 40 hours in a week with this tells me it certainly could be. You ever played a game where you can have a sword in your hand and a rocket launcher strapped to your legs? It was so much fun to play, its silly, nonsensical story, the Sega hat tips.
Welcome to my fantasy zone. Get ready.
And of course, climbing to the moon.
Bayonetta!
The first Uncharted was a revelation for me. It introduced me to how modern dual-stick shooters worked. Uncharted 2 perfects the gameplay of the first and ups the quality of the level design, not just because it's more interesting to look at, but because it allows better use of Drake's abilities. The game is at its best when you can seamlessly use Drake's climbing, stealth, firearm, and melee skills all in tandem, allowing flexible approaches to almost any situation, resulting in a game that I love going back to. Super Mario Galaxy is essentially everything I ever wanted out of the Mario universe, yet it surpassed my dreams in almost every way. As much as I've loved all of the main series Mario games, they had so rarely matched what I saw in my mind as a kid until now. The space theme let the designers go wild with their imaginations, every galaxy bursting with detail and creativity. Then there's the orchestral soundtrack that's one of the finest of the generation and a first of its kind for Nintendo. While the demented Mario 64 fanatic in me wished Mario's movement felt a bit quicker and looser like in 1996, I got used to it, and that was hardly enough to stop Mario Galaxy from being an incredible experience for a lifelong fan of the series and my personal pick for best game of the past generation.
I had to go with Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, for my number one pick. This was probably the most influential game of the generation, and for good reason. A story that keeps you guessing with a habit of always upping the ante. The set pieces are the real star of the show here, of course. I mean, that's what people will remember about this game. And really, the whole series. I played through Uncharted 2 no less than 4 times since it came out, and I'll keep going back to it. Game of the generation. So there you have it. There's tons of games that didn't make this list that we wish we could have included.
Remember, we don't necessarily think these are the definitive best or most innovative or most earth-shattering games of the generation, but they're simply the ones we enjoyed the most.
It's truly been a crazy ride these past 7 years, and I can't wait to see what's in store for us in the future. We'll see you on the other side.